Hi, friends. Thank you for joining me. I'm gonna try to make this quick because I want to get home tonight. But this was fun. This was a nice change of pace. I've been doing a lot of like I want to say I've been doing a lot of short form indie games. That's not necessarily true. I've been doing short form takes on a lot of indie games, which I also really enjoy, and I feel like it's really, really cool to be able to bring devs in and talk with them, and sometimes that works out better than other times. But generally, like, I find it really fascinating, and I think it adds something to the conversation that the community can have about the games. We've had some really, really good results of that. I love doing that, and I want to keep doing that, but I do also really enjoy this kind of format, and finding the right game for this can be tough, because it doesn't always work. I literally did a Google search for games like Among the Sleep this morning, and there aren't a lot of games like Among the Sleep, but I remember that being sort of a high point for me of doing play-by-play. But Nancy Drew is another one. Nancy Drew is a really solid streaming experience, and I am glad that I'm doing this again. And we will probably not play this like straight through week on week, because when we have the opportunity to bring devs in and play games with them, I would really, really like to do it. I know where Eve is hard at work sort of trying to make connections with folks, and we're looking at some stuff with like Hinterlands and Fulbright and Girls Make Games, and all of those I think are really neat projects, and if we can get developers involved, like I don't want to pass up the opportunities to do that. But I am excited to continue playing Nancy Drew, and I feel like it is a good fit for this stream, just sort of in general. So I hope everybody is enjoying it as much as you anticipated, as sort of demonstrated in the Twitter poll results. Okay, let's look at questions about this game. There are some good ones that I frankly don't know how to answer, but we're just gonna burn through it, I think. So here we go. Question: you said you like the dialogue, and while I agree it has some good individual lines, the pacing and delivery feels so awkward and stilted. Do you think the content of the dialogue is more important than the delivery and pacing, or do you disagree that those things are bad in this game? I think they're uneven. And unevenness is something that is tricky, and is tricky for us to sort of grapple with as consumers of any kind of media. Voice acting is hard. Dialogue writing, writing for games is also really hard. I would say that in general, I'm pretty happy with the voice acting, but I agree that there are individual lines that feel a little bit stilted, and it's hard to tell whether that's from the performance of them or the writing of the lines themselves. And on that front, my general feeling is that there's some structural weakness in the construction of this script, and that is what sort of trips me up. There's a lot of characters who start sort of conversations in ways that don't seem entirely natural, or conversation flows that don't sort of move in a really supernatural way. Nancy herself, I think, gets a lot of lines that are kind of just awkward lines, because she's not contributing a lot to conversations for the most part. That said, like, there is some fucking standout dialogue, right? And Nancy gets some of those lines, and other characters get those lines too. And I love that. I feel like that makes up for a lot. There's a question in my mind as to whether the overall quality of this game, from a, like, I don't even know, like, what perspective to sort of take this from, but from some perspective, would the quality of this game be increased if voice acting was foregone, if it forewent voice acting, I guess, if it asked the player to just read all of the dialogue rather than have it performed. And I feel like that's possible, but I get why they do it. I think that voiced dialogue in games, especially this kind of game for this kind of audience, is a big selling point. Like, I think that it makes it easier for players to, play the game maybe a little bit more. I don't want to say passively, but to be a little bit more immersed in the game, especially players who aren't big readers, which there's no reason why you would have to be to play this game. I mean, it does ask actually a lot of you in terms of reading, but making the game accessible to more people, like, I don't think that that's a bad thing. And I really truly do like a lot of the performance. I have been talking an enormous amount over the past 2 days about uncanny valleys, and the one that we think about most is the uncanny valley between computer generated graphics and photoreal graphics, photography, specifically in, like, special effects and CG inserted characters in movies and that kind of thing. I think that there is also an uncanny valley in a lot, not just Nancy Drew, but a lot of games performance. And I don't know exactly what causes that, like what the production constraints are that differentiate this from a high quality AAA game that has really top notch vocal production. I don't know. It's tough because, like I say, in general, I like the performance. And I like a lot of the writing. And I think that so far, like, the mystery is the, like, big picture narrative is working for me. And, for a lot of the individual lines are working for me. But there is something sort of awkward about the, like, conversation at that level. So there was a question about, like, whether content is more important than delivery, and that's... I mean, yes, I guess. In a mystery game, yeah. It is, because a lot of, what you're doing in a detective game is you're trying to gather together evidence. You're trying to gather together an understanding of all of what's going on. You're trying to paint a whole picture of the crime scene, essentially. And the information that you get from characters is a huge part of that. And even talking to characters in a way that is trivial, that isn't giving you case-related information, needs to be presented with the same sort of level of framing, so that you're not, in order to sort of obscure the important details. I mean, it depends on the case, on the way that the case is structured. And Nancy Drew, I guess, is a little bit different than Agatha Christie, but certainly in a traditional mystery, right, you're presented with too much information and then have to try to work out what is the salient information. And there's an element of that, I think, to Nancy Drew. It is not the core of the mystery. The core of the mystery is more about puzzles and locks. But there's absolutely an element of it, of trying to like get information from all kinds of sources, including out of people. And so the content of those conversations is, vitally important to the mechanics of the game. And trumps, I think, their presentation. It's a weird question, though, because there's not a reason that you would need to make that trade-off, I guess. There's no reason why you couldn't have both content-rich dialogue and well-written dialogue. Except, I guess, that dialogue is hard to write, if you can't get, maybe this is the trade-off that's being proposed. If you can't get well-written dialogue, then maybe cut out all of that dialogue and just have a dialogue-light game, which some games can get away with, maybe. Certainly some games can get away with better. I think Nancy Drew would have a real hard time with that. Because if you limited the amount that you could talk to these characters, even if the characters don't generally give you a ton of useful information, if you limit the amount that you can talk to them, then it feels like you are being bad at investigation, because interrogating people is a core part of the feel of investigating this crime scene. Those are my thoughts. I know this isn't the first game in the series that you've played. What drew you to the series? Ha ha ha. I mean, not one thing. Obviously, the first Nancy Drew game that I played, well, actually not, but I played a little bit of something about ashes to ashes, ashes of embers, ash, the Pokemon Master. There's a Nancy Drew Ashes game that I played a little bit of, and then got kind of baffled by and stopped playing and set aside, and haven't gone back to. But the main one that I first played was Shadow at the Water's Edge on Mostly Walking, and so really I think Sean picked that, and that was fun. I mean, it was frustrating in a lot of places, but it was a well put together game. It clearly had design behind it, and then from there. Well, I mean, I'd be lying if I didn't say that, actually, I have a friend who was a student a couple of years ago, who is a huge Nancy Drew fan and was also a Mostly Walking fan. And so we talked a bunch about the intersection of those two things and about other Nancy Drew games. And she's the one who recommended Ghost of Thornton Hall to me. Actually, I think recommended both. Maybe I'm the one who picked out Shadow at the Water's Edge and suggested it to Sean. I don't 100% remember, but it might have been because my friend recommended that to me, and also Ghost at Thornton Hall. And so after we played Shadow at the Water's Edge, I played Ghost at Thornton Hall. But honestly, like, a big part of that for me was I'm super intrigued by a series that has gone on for as long as Nancy Drew has, and has undergone the kind of, like, really visible step-by-step evolution of these, like, I mean, they release on a regular, well, I don't know about regular actually, but like frequent schedule. They do like a couple of releases a year, so you can see incremental improvement, incremental evolution in the style and technology that is being used to produce these games, and that I find super fascinating. I love that this is a franchise that takes a lot of what we would consider like mainstream, hardcore, core audience game conventions, and uses them in a franchise that is explicitly marketed towards an audience that is not a core game audience and is a primarily female audience. And I think that's awesome. A lot of the game industry's interaction with women as a market is not fantastic. I mean, like, the games industry has a long history of like the toys industry in general. I mean, frankly, like, conflating games for girls with toy products rather than quote unquote serious entertainment products. But pink games, like pink toys, have a deep history with the games industry, and that is getting better. Certainly, that's getting much, much better. And there are more and more games that are produced that are for women or designed to be accessible to women, that are on par on every level with other games that aren't necessarily focused on that audience, or even sort of particularly inclusive of that audience. But for a long time, that was really not the case. And Nancy Drew has been around for decades. Like, this franchise, her Interactive's Nancy Drew series, is like fucking tentpole of the games industry and gets very little mainstream media attention. It does not get, it doesn't get attention in any of the venues that other games do. But it has never been, as far as I understand, certainly now, none of the games that I've played are pink games, in the sense that they're sort of like second-rate products, quality products that are marketed towards women. These are good games. These are solidly built, lovingly crafted. Like, there's clearly a lot of care that goes into these games, and the quality is high. The quality is high, although it is uneven. And, like, for example, in the writing and the voice acting, and we see lots of things that is not, like, super, super smooth in these games. But I would very, very strongly attribute that not to a sort of lack of care, on the part of Her Interactive and more on the way in which they are produced. This is an extensive franchise that is they produce games on a deadline. Like, they produce them very, very frequently, and they produce them, and they're independent. They are not like part of or backed by the sort of major moneyed players in the games industry. So all of that is like, it has to factor into understanding the quality of these games. But as like indie games, I think they do really, really well, and I love the way that they're produced. So anyway, I've been sort of aware of them for a long time because there are so many of them and they go back for so long. I have had friends, this student and others who have been fans of them and have turned me on to them. I read Nancy Drew growing up. Like, I've always loved Nancy Drew, so there's an appeal to that as well. Sweet, cool. That was a long answer for essentially a pun question. What are differences and similarities of this game to other games in the series that you've played, and do they affect how you see the series in any way? I mean, frankly, the biggest difference that I have seen so far that I can like put my finger on, because it's been a while since Ghost of Thornton Hall, like it's been a while since I played a Nancy Drew game, is the the biggest difference is that one of the core mechanics, the mechanic is still essentially the same, and that is that you have a cell phone which you can use to call friends for information and help. In the other games that I played, it seemed sort of a staple that those friends were George and Bess, who are traditionally Nancy Drew's best friends. And then in Thornton Hall, I think like she also had a boyfriend or something that you could call and talk to, which was fine. The fact that it's the Hardy Boys here feels like it is a substantial change, even though the mechanic so far is basically exactly the same. The puzzles have been really straightforward so far, which I appreciate. I don't know if it's because I have gotten into the escape rooms and escape room culture in the past couple of years, that I immediately draw a lot of connections between this style of game and escape rooms. And escape room design. Obviously, like, we've played other games that have an even closer connection. Jesus, what was the name of that one? I have it right here. I think I'm gonna look it up. No, I don't see it. Played one not long. Oh, The Guest. The Guest was a digital escape room, like escape the room game, and digital escape the room games have been around, are like the inspiration for physical escape room games. But Nancy Drew is constructed in many ways more like an escape room game than an Agatha Christie mystery, right? It is less about I just read Murder on the Orient Express. Murder on the Orient Express is really interesting because There is a little bit of physical investigation. Like, they go to the crime scene and they kind of look around, and they have a doctor examine the body, and he tells them some things about like how the wounds were inflicted. And they like look at what doors were locked and that kind of thing. But at least subjectively, most of the investigation was, okay, let's just talk to every person and see like what their story, what their alibi is, and what they saw, what they witnessed. And then we're going to talk to a dozen people. They're going to tell us everything that they know. And then as a reader, can you filter through all of that information and figure out the solution to the mystery? That's not how Nancy Drew works. Like, there is a little bit of trying to like gather information and figure out what's really going on, but it is more about information being gated behind specific distinct locks. And so progressing through a series of locked doors by, finding or solving the keys for those in order to open all of these doors and get to the next piece of information that's on the other side. At this point, I feel like I'm still early on in the mystery, but I haven't noticed anything that I recognize as like really a structural change from other games. I do think that there's like the interface for the phone is pretty good. It could still be better, but I remember it being like pretty bad in other games, and so I think it's been improved. The interface for some of the puzzles seems like really straightforward in a way that it wasn't always. Although Thornton Hall was pretty good, I think. Shadow at the Water's Edge had some puzzles that were just sort of like odd types of puzzles to have in a game. But yeah. Okay, so that was a long way to answer a question where the answer is really just like, no, I don't really see a lot of differences. Do you think... Okay, so here's the question that I don't know how to answer. Fuck. Do you think games have an obligation to be well-researched and accurate when they incorporate real history? Alright, so there's two parts to this. One of them is Nancy Drew specific. And I would say that part of the intention behind her interactive is to use these games as a vehicle to give information to teach, essentially, but not to teach like pedagogically, more to sort of like give out information that might prove interesting to their players, who are mostly young girls. I would say probably mostly preteen and teenage women. So there's definitely like an educational component to this, and I base this partially on what I have seen in this and other Nancy Drew games, but this one especially, and what I know about her interactive as a development studio. They have a game that is out that is called... I don't remember what it's called. They have a game that is primarily a like really early how to code, like learning how to program game that is themed after Nancy Drew. So that is very much explicitly an educational game. And then they just launched, I think, a new initiative to get further into the educational game space, although I don't know much about that. So I know they have an interest in education in games. This game in particular seems to be like very information heavy, but there were definitely like there was historical and geographical, I guess geocultural information in especially Shadow at the Water's Edge, and I think also Thornton Hall to some extent. Thornton Hall also had some like physics and chemistry, like more STEM-y kinds of puzzles in it as well. And I think all of that is of interest to Her Interactive. Can we make games that have some educational value, not necessarily games that are pedagogical, although their mobile programming game is it called Codes and Clues? Somebody in chat said Codes and Clues, and that sounds familiar to me, so maybe that's the name of it. Okay, so that's Her Interactive, and so from that perspective, I think if you are intending to like impart any kind of information, even if, as like Nancy Drew, I think it is just surface level. It's just sort of basic, like, here's some things that you might not know about a topic that you can follow up on if you're interested in learning more. The sort of more general question of games that incorporate history, and I'm gonna take a step back because there's no difference to me in this between games that incorporate history and media that incorporates history in general. I'm not sure why you would draw a distinction there, so I'm not going to. I mean, we can explore that further if somebody wants, but is there an obligation when you're creating media that incorporates history to be accurate and to be especially well researched? Because accurate is one thing. Accurate means that, like, you're not, I mean, they're both things, really. But there is definitely a difference between not being blatantly wrong and being well researched. And well researched to me implies not only do you get your facts right, but you are exploring those facts within a context that includes like relatively complete depth of knowledge about the field and incorporates the multiplicity of perspectives and historical opinions that exist about any historical moment, right? I mean, I've actually done games about this, about historiography, and the way that there are lots of different ways to interpret history, and sometimes there are like leading interpretations of history, but generally there are multiple leading interpretations at any sort of moment in history, and we're at a moment right now where it's really important to look at history from the multiple viewpoints of all of the different peoples who are involved in that history. And like, that's fucking tough to do. Like, that involves a lot of work and like very considered, thoughtful, and frankly like expert input on the project. And I don't know that I want to say that like that is an obligation for every piece of media that touches on a historical subject. I do think that there are media for which it is really important that that they delve into that kind of depth on their subject matter. But I don't know that it's any media that touches the subject. And for this game, for example, I mean, like, there's accuracy we can talk about, and I don't know enough of the history of Greece to like have identified inaccuracies in the history. I'm sure there are other people who know a lot more than me and have. And that's one thing. Like, wanting to not have inaccuracies and wanting to correct inaccuracies is I think that's totally valid. I also think that this is a game that is about historical knowledge at a very surface level, and I am willing to tolerate some level of inaccuracy as long as it's not sort of undercutting, I guess, like the big ideas that might encourage somebody to explore more of this topic, or to get a sense of like an overview of the topic, which is, I think, all that this game is really attempting to do. I mean, some level of inaccuracy is necessary to give, you know, an overview of any subject. Any domain knowledge becomes ridiculously complicated if you delve deeply into it, and so it's really hard to summarize that deep complication in a surface level summary of the topic. And this game and its sort of treatment of Greek history, like, I think you can go deep into the research of Greek history, and if I were constructing an actual museum of Greek antiquities, I think that is something that I would want the museum to do. If I'm making a mystery game that happens to take place in a museum of Greek antiquities, then I don't think that there's the same obligation on the developer to do that. Partially because it could conceivably be prohibitive if we like tried to impose that standard on all games, and partially because it's just, that's not what this game is about. This game is at its heart, it's this detective story, and this is the setting for the detective story. And I think that you have to do, like, you have to have a reasonable amount of realism and truth to your depiction of that setting, but this game is not an exploration of Greek history or Greek culture, and maybe that's where it actually makes a mistake, is conflating these sort of like simplified ideas of Greek mythology with Greek culture as a like bigger concept. But so far, I can't say that I have a problem with it. I mean, I feel like it is, it is not demanding. This story does not demand like a rigorous examination of the historical sort of field. Dragon question we're going to wait on. We're definitely going to come back to this game later. Achievement or progress you make in this game or other Nancy Drew games makes up for all of the time you are stuck in the game. In general, I'm going to say no, and that's a subjective answer. Like, I know there are some people for whom that balance is substantially different than it is for me. For me, there's rarely an excuse for a game that is set up in a way that I would get like stuck in it. And I'm sure that I'm sure that I will get frustrated by Labyrinth of Lies at some point, because I remember this arc from Thornton Hall especially, because I actually played it, but also Shadow at the Water's Edge, because I watched Sean playing it. These games tend to start off really, really strong in terms of intentionality and leading and cueing and like creating these puzzles that are really understandable. And that doesn't always last for the whole game. But this session of playing this Nancy Drew game, like, I did not feel like I got stuck ever. I know that there were sort of moments when I was trying to do something and it didn't work, or I wanted to do something and I couldn't figure it out. But the game, part of that, like, it is inexcusable for me to be stuck, is that for me, being stuck is a level of, like, I don't know what my options are for making a next move. I appear to have no next moves that I can make. And Nancy Drew, between and part of this is, again, familiarity with the tropes of the franchise, but between, like, the phone and your to-do list is really, really good at continually prodding you towards things that you still are able to do. So I have not gotten to a point where I've looked at, like, all of the options available to me and said none of these seem to be meaningful. I literally can't make progress on any of my to-do lists, and none of the people that I can talk to can give me any new information. Then at that point, conceivably, I could get stuck, and that is frustrating. And I don't appreciate sort of any of the time that I spend stuck in a game. Nancy Drew is one of the better games. It is one of the better structures for making sure that you don't get stuck. Certainly among this style of lock and key, inventory management adventure games. There are a lot of other adventure games that are way more obscure about what it is you are meant to be making progress on. And that leads to a lot more frustrating stuckness. For me, like, there's absolutely an argument to be made that, like, the more time you spend trying to figure out a puzzle, the better it feels when you finally figure it out. I got none of that. Like, that is not me. Other people, if you feel that way, then, like, God bless you. But for me, I'm just frustrated by the time that I spent feeling lost. I don't want to feel like that when I'm playing a game. So I appreciate the design elements in Nancy Drew that mitigate that feeling when I'm playing the game. Is there anything this game has to say about the ethics of investigation? Is Nancy still sociopathically uncaring about people's emotions? This is a good question. Let's bring this question back. Like, I want to keep up with this question. I feel like in general, Nancy Drew is a better game protagonist than like any of the adventure game protagonists that we have ever anywhere, because she engages in much more empathic, like emotionally driven conversation with characters in the world. And even if a lot of her methods are sometimes suspect, as other characters in other games are, like, she takes a lot of stuff that is just not nailed down. But actually, a lot of the stuff that she takes, I mean, like, a healthy percentage of my inventory right now is stuff that was given to me and not stuff that I, like, broke in and stole. And a lot of the, like, breaking in that I have done has been with the tacit approval of the people who, own those spaces and objects. Like, I'm here not because, like, I'm internally driven to just solve this mystery. I've actually been brought on by somebody who trusts me and has entrusted with me this job, and I don't even go around, like, just accusing people or interrogating them. I go around, kind of trying to get to know them and what makes them tick and see if I can help them. And I feel like there is a pretty striking difference between, if we're looking at this as an adventure game, between Nancy Drew and other adventure game characters. Some of that is like, we're early yet in this game, so let's see how Nancy Drew feels as a nascent sociopath when we get a couple more hours in. Like, maybe my tune will change. Okay, sweet, kick ass. This was fun, guys. That was a short, like, 50-minute Q&A, so thank you for that. It's always a blast. It's always a pleasure. I really appreciate you all being here. I hope you had a lovely time and a good night. And I'm not 100% sure if gonna be continuing this game next week, or if we're gonna manage to get something else, but that's gonna be the general schedule. Is we'll play some Nancy Drew for a while, except when we can schedule specific other things. This week was the first week of classes at USC. It's very, very exciting. I'm thrilled to have gotten to meet a lot of the new students and to see some of my students from last year return from summer vacation. So I'm buzzing about that, and I'm thrilled to be playing Nancy Drew and hanging out with you guys. That's it. That's it for me. Have a good night. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next week. Yeah. Thanks again. Bye.